I'll be honest with you. When people ask me how it started, I always pause before I answer. Not because I don't remember. I remember every single second of that afternoon like it's burned into the back of my eyes. I pause because I'm never sure where to begin. Do I start with the insult? Do I start with the war? Do I start with Marcus? I think I'll start with the room. Because if you didn't see that room, you wouldn't understand why the insult landed the way it did. And if you didn't understand that, you'd miss the whole point of what happened after. The Hall of Consolidated Records was on the fourth sublevel of the Galactic Administrative Compound on Myrth Station. I'd been there twice before, both times for paperwork. Both times it was boring as watching paint dry on a wall in zero gravity. But this third time was different, because this time it wasn't just about filing fleet casualty reports or submitting requisition codes for new medical supplies. This time, they were doing the post-war accounting. You have to understand what that means in the context of the Kethalori conflict. It wasn't just a war. It was 18 months of something that most species in the Galactic Assembly still have trouble describing in polite language. 6 inhabited systems, 11 major engagements, 3 sieges that lasted longer than most member species' lifespans. And when it finally ended, when the Keth signed the cessation accords and pulled back behind the Orlon boundary, the Assembly needed to sit down and count what was left. Not land, not ships, people. So they built the count room. That's what soldiers called it anyway. The official name was the Interspecies Casualty Reconciliation Chamber, which is the kind of name only a bureaucrat could love. But everyone who went through it just called it the count room, because that's what it was. A massive, circular hall with representation seats arranged in tiered rings, every major species that had sent combatants to the conflict represented by their liaison, and a central display column that updated in real time as each species' figures were submitted, verified, and locked in. Big glowing numbers, floating in the air above a black pedestal. Blue for the Velthani, gold for the Sauri, white for the Orin Collective, amber for the Marethian Confederacy, and so on for 16 different species. The humans were at the far end of the chamber. Small corner, 2 seats, 1 desk. Our liaison was a woman named Captain Yolande Fern, short, gray-haired, the kind of person who looked like she'd been built in a factory specifically to disagree with things. She had a stack of data pads in front of her and a cup of something hot that she was ignoring. I was there as her assistant. Technically, my role was administrative support, which meant I carried the secondary data pads, kept the physical copies in order, and answered questions from the verification team when Captain Fern was busy with something else. I was a corporal, 23 years old. I'd served 8 months in the conflict, mostly in the Orel sector. I'd seen enough that I didn't sleep very well anymore, but I was still young enough to think that keeping busy would eventually fix that. So I was busy. I was arranging documents, cross-referencing numbers, doing all the things a good corporal does when he wants to look useful, and I wasn't really paying attention to the room around me, not until the Velthani liaison started talking. The Velthani are hard to describe if you've never seen one. They're tall, most of them come in around 2.5 meters, with long, double-jointed limbs and faces that look like someone took a wolf's skull and stretched it into something almost human. They move quietly for their size, and they have a habit of standing very still when they're not moving, like statues that learn to breathe. Their liaison was named Evrath Saul. I'd seen him twice before in the compound corridors. He had the kind of bearing that came from centuries of military tradition. His species had been spacefaring for something like 4,000 years, and they didn't let you forget it. Not in a rude way, exactly. Just in the way some old families carry themselves, like history was something they wore on their shoulders. He was presenting the Velthani casualty figures. His voice carried across the chamber without any apparent effort, smooth, measured, every word placed precisely. The Velthani war host committed 42,700 active combatants to the conflict across 18 months, he said. Our losses were significant. 4,217 confirmed dead, 11,800 wounded, an additional 900 classified as missing in action, of whom approximately 60% have since been accounted for. A murmur around the room. Those were serious numbers. The Velthani didn't lose 4,000 soldiers lightly. Their training cycle was something like 6 years. Losing 4,200 of them was a generational wound. The display column updated. Velthani figures glowed blue above the pedestal. Other species followed. The Sauri, who'd committed mostly orbital support units and lost relatively few, but sustained serious equipment damage. The Orin Collective, whose casualty methodology was complicated because they reproduced by fission and defining an individual death was philosophically challenging. The Marethians, who'd taken brutal losses in the second Orel engagement, and whose liaison delivered their numbers in a voice so flat you could see them working hard to hold it together. Each species stood, gave their count, and sat down. It was solemn, you'd expect it to be. These were the dead. Whatever politics surrounded the conflict, and there were plenty of politics, the counting of the dead was supposed to be a moment of collective acknowledgement, something sacred almost. And then it came around to us. Captain Fern stood up. She didn't look nervous. She never looked nervous. She had the kind of face that had moved past nervousness several decades ago and replaced it with something calmer and more durable. She cleared her throat. Humanity committed approximately 91,000 active combatants across the full duration of the conflict, she began. Our verified dead number. Excuse me. The interruption came from the Velthani side of the chamber. Not from Evrath Sal himself, but from one of his junior staff, a younger officer named, as I'd later learn, Veth Coral. He was standing without having been given the floor, which was already unusual. His expression was harder to read than his superiors, but something about the angle of his ears and the set of his jaw suggested he wasn't standing up to offer condolences. I apologize for the interruption, he said, which sounded like the opposite of an apology. But before the human representative continues, I'd like to note something for the record. Captain Fern looked at him. She didn't say anything. She just looked, which was its own kind of answer. He continued anyway. Humanity's contribution to this conflict has been extensively documented, Veth Coral said, including some figures that the Assembly's strategists have found, statistically irregular. He paused just long enough to make the pause mean something. Specifically, the confirmed kill count attributed to human forces. Per the preliminary reconciliation data, human soldiers account for approximately 63% of total confirmed Keth eliminations across all species combined. Another pause. Despite representing only 22% of total allied combatant numbers. Silence. He kept going. I raise this not to challenge the data, but because these figures were a point of discussion among several delegations during last evening's session. He spread his long hands, that gesture the Velthani made when they were being deliberately reasonable. There is a question of whether the human kill count methodology differs from standard assembly verification protocols, or whether, and here something shifted in his tone, just slightly, the way a blade shifts when you turn it, there are other explanations. Captain Fern's expression didn't change. But I looked at her hands, and her right hand had gone still on top of the datapad stack. Completely still. The way a hand goes still when the person it's attached to is working very hard to keep it from doing something else. I felt something cold move through my chest. Because I knew what Veth Coral was saying. I knew the other explanations he was gesturing at without quite naming. He wasn't accusing the human military of falsifying data. He was doing something more precise than that. He was suggesting that the numbers were real, but the way they'd been achieved was somehow disreputable. That 63% of confirmed kills was a number that said something unflattering about the species that produced it. He was suggesting that humans were, at their core, built for killing, and that this was a problem, a thing to be noted in the record, a strangeness to be flagged. And all around the chamber, I could feel the attention of every other delegation settle on us. Not hostile, not supportive, just watching, waiting to see how the small species in the far corner of the room would respond to being told their most significant contribution to the war was uncomfortable. Captain Fern set down her datapad. She looked at Veth Coral for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then she turned slightly, just enough to look at me. I was 23 years old. I had arranged documents and carried datapads, and served 8 months in a war that had left me unable to sleep. I did not have the bearing of Evrath Sol, or the composure of the Oran delegation leader, or the practiced neutrality of the Marethian liaison. But Captain Fern looked at me like she was handing me something. "Corporal Vale," she said quietly, "I think this one's yours." I want to tell you that I stood up smoothly, that I had something prepared, that I walked to the center of the chamber with confidence and spoke with the kind of calm authority that makes people remember a speech for years. I did not do any of those things. I stood up and I knocked my secondary datapad stack onto the floor, and I had to bend down and pick it up, and at least 3 of the documents inside were now out of order. My chair made a sound when I pushed it back. My boots were slightly muddy from the transit corridor outside, and I'd forgotten to wipe them. I walked to the middle of the room. It wasn't that far, maybe 12 meters. It felt like more. I stood there and I looked at Veth Coral, and I thought about Marcus. Marcus Obo was from Lagos. He told me that the first day we met, in the receiving bay of the Orel Sector Forward Operating Station. He'd said it like it mattered, which it did, though I didn't know why yet. "Lagos," he'd said, shaking my hand. "You know it." "I know where it is," I'd said. "Close enough." He was 6'2", built like someone had been very serious about the instructions. He had a way of smiling that started slowly and then arrived all at once, like weather. He was 26 years old, which made him older than me, which in our unit made him experienced. What Marcus was a rifleman. Not a sniper, not a specialist, not any of the categories that people assign to soldiers when they want to explain extraordinary performance. He was a rifleman with a standard-issue Mk7 pulse rifle who had, over 18 months of conflict, accumulated a confirmed kill count that the post-combat verification team had initially flagged as a potential data error, and then, after extensive review, confirmed as accurate. 247 confirmed kills. That number isn't something I say lightly. I'm not saying it to glorify it. I'm saying it because it matters to the story, and because if I leave it out, what happened in the count room doesn't make the same kind of sense. 247 confirmed kills. And Marcus had come home from the war with all 4 limbs, both eyes, and a slight tremor in his left hand that he said was from caffeine, but everyone knew wasn't. I had been with him for 6 of those 18 months. I'd watched him work, and here's what I can tell you about how Marcus Obo did what he did. He cared. That sounds simple. It sounds like the kind of thing people say about soldiers when they don't know what else to say, but I mean something specific when I say it. Marcus cared about the mission in a way that wasn't about pride or glory or the numbers. He cared about the people on his side. He cared about them with a kind of focus that was almost frightening to be near, because it meant that when something threatened them, something in Marcus got very, very quiet. And when Marcus got very quiet, extraordinary things happened. I remember the night outside Orel 7. We'd been pinned for 6 hours. The Keth had a suppression unit in an elevated position that we could not move around and could not go through. 7 people in my squad, 3 of them were wounded. Our comms were jammed. Every time we shifted, fire came down from that ridge. Marcus had looked at the ridge for a long time. He'd looked at it the way you look at a math problem, methodically, without hurry. Then he'd handed me his secondary pack and said, "Stay here." I'd said, "Marcus, I'll be back in 20, he'd said. "If I'm not, use the northeast route, keep low." He'd gone into the dark, alone, with his rifle and whatever he kept in that quiet space behind his eyes. 17 minutes later, the fire from the ridge stopped. Marcus came back in 19 minutes, which meant he'd given himself 2 minutes of margin and used 17 of them. He was breathing slightly harder than usual. There was dust on his jacket. He picked up his secondary pack, looked at the 7 of us and said, "Northeast route's still better, but we've got time now." He never told me what happened up there. I never asked, because I already knew what it cost him. I'd seen it in his face when he came back. Not pride, not satisfaction, just that same quiet. The quiet of someone who has done something necessary that they will carry forever. I stood in the center of the count room, and I looked at Veth Coral. "You're right that the numbers are real," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I wasn't sure why. 63% of confirmed Keth eliminations were made by human forces, I continued. And yes, we were 22% of total Allied combatants. Those two facts are both true, and you're asking what they mean. Veth Coral looked at me with that polite Velthani stillness. "I am asking the assembly to consider the question," he said. "Then let me help you consider it," I said. I moved to the central display column. I wasn't sure if I was allowed to do this, but no one stopped me. I called up the human casualty data. Captain Fern had already loaded it in. It was sitting there waiting for her presentation, and I pulled up the breakdown by engagement. "First Orel siege," I said. 14 weeks. Human forces held the southern corridor for 11 of those 14 weeks. Allied casualty rates in that corridor before human units arrived, 43% per engagement. After, 11%. I let that sit for a second. "The Velthani war host," I said, and I looked at Evrath Sol, not Veth Coral, because I wanted to speak to the person who'd actually been there, not the one who'd been comfortable elsewhere. "We're in the northern corridor. Your liaison reported that the northern corridor held for 9 weeks before consolidation. It held because the southern corridor didn't collapse. The southern corridor didn't collapse because human units absorbed the primary push." Evrath Sol was looking at me. His expression was unreadable, but he hadn't looked away. "Myrth Station Orbital Defense," I said. "The third engagement. Keth breakthrough force, estimated strength of 400 vessels. Human naval units were first contact. We lost 11 ships in the first 6 hours. We slowed the breakthrough enough that Sowery orbital batteries could reposition." I looked at the Sowery delegation. Their liaison mentioned today that Sowery forces sustained relatively low casualties. That's accurate. In part because human ships went first. I pulled up another screen. "Kareth Colony," I said. "Civilian evacuation under fire. Velthani doctrine, and I mean no disrespect to a doctrine that has been developed over 4,000 years of serious military tradition, does not include combined combat extraction operations. It's not a flaw. It's a specialization choice. Your forces are extraordinary in pitched engagement, but pulling wounded civilians out of a burning settlement while maintaining a suppression perimeter is a different skill set." I paused. Human forces evacuated 4,700 civilians from Kareth Colony in 9 hours while under sustained fire. Confirmed Keth eliminations during that operation, 312. Those are some of your 63%. The room was quiet. Not the waiting quiet from before, something different. I looked back at Veth Coral. "You asked if there are other explanations for the numbers," I said. "There are, here they are." I held up one finger. Humans fighting closer than most species are trained to. Close quarters combat produces higher kill count to engagement ratios. It also produces higher friendly casualties. We know this. We accept this trade-off because the alternative is letting the engagement go to the enemy. I held up a second finger. Humans don't withdraw by default. When a position needs to be held and it's our position to hold, we hold it until we're told otherwise or until we physically can't. That produces kill counts. It also produces the dead we're about to present to this room. Third finger. Humans are scared, I said. All the time, in every engagement, the Velthani have a physiological response to combat that has been studied. Your cortisol analog spikes, your pain tolerance increases, your focus narrows. It's well documented and genuinely impressive. I looked at Veth Coral. Humans have the same response, but we also have something in addition to it, something that doesn't have a clean scientific name. It's the part that looks at an impossible situation and decides that impossibility is something that happens to other people. I let that land. That part, I said, is why the numbers are what they are. I stepped back from the display column. I'm not saying human soldiers are superior, I said. I'm saying they are specifically shaped by their history to do specific things in specific circumstances, and those circumstances were the circumstances of this conflict. I looked around the chamber. Every species in this room contributed something irreplaceable: Velthani tactical precision, Sauri orbital support, Orin logistics, Marethian intelligence operations. I paused. Humans went first. Humans held the line. Humans came home with a kill count that makes some of you uncomfortable. I turned back to Veth Coral. I understand the discomfort, I said. I do, because that number isn't just a number. It means something happened to produce it, and that something was people. Are people going into situations where someone had to be eliminated or our people died? We eliminated more than our share because we put ourselves in the position to have to. I stopped. Then I said the thing I'd been working toward since I stood up. The corporal you're talking to, I said, was in the Orel sector for 6 months. I served with a man named Marcus Obo, confirmed 247 kills. He's alive. He has a tremor in his left hand that he says is from caffeine. I paused. He doesn't sleep well either. Neither of us do. I let a breath out. I'd like Captain Fern to present our figures now, I said, if that's all right. I walked back to my seat. I knocked a different document stack slightly. I sat down. Captain Fern looked at me for a moment. Then she stood up. Human casualties, she said in her flat, practical voice. Confirmed dead, 12,417. Wounded, 31,842. Missing in action, 2,903, of whom 700 have since been accounted for. She sat down. 12,417. The human figure floated up in the display column. It was the largest number in the room by a significant margin, larger than the Velthani dead by a factor of nearly 3, larger than the Sauri, the Orin, the Marethians combined. The room was very quiet. Evrath Saul, the Velthani senior liaison, was looking at the number, not at me, not at Captain Fern, at the number. He stayed looking at it for a long time. Then he bowed his head, just once. The Velthani warriors' acknowledgement, I'd only ever seen it in their historical records. It meant something specific in their culture. It meant, I see, I understand, I carry this with me. Veth Coral didn't say anything else for the rest of the session. After it was over, Captain Fern and I gathered our datapads in silence and walked down the corridor toward the transit bay. We were almost at the lift when she spoke. "Where did that come from?" she asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. She made a small sound. It wasn't quite a laugh. You know what the worst part of being human is in rooms like that? "What?" "We always have to explain ourselves," she said. "Every species in there has a reputation that walks in before they do. The Velthani walk in and everyone knows they're ancient and precise and formidable. The Orin walk in and everyone knows they're distributed and patient. The Myrethians walk in and everyone knows they're clever. She paused. We walk in and everyone wonders if the numbers are accurate. They're accurate, I said. I know, she said. You know what else is accurate? I waited. Every one of those 12,000, she said. Every single one, accurate. We got in the lift, the doors closed. She looked straight ahead at the doors. Marcus Obo, she said. He's getting a commendation, in case you wanted to know. He'll hate that, I said. I know, she said. I'm giving it to him anyway. I went back to my quarters that evening. I lay on my bunk and looked at the ceiling of the station and thought about numbers. 12,417. I knew some of them. Not all, you can't know 12,000 people, but some. I'd trained with 9 of them before deployment. I'd shared meals with maybe 20 more. I'd been in the same engagements as at least 100. Tevi Marsh, who'd been in my original training cohort and who'd been killed in the second week of the Orel siege, and who had been the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday. Lieutenant Kang, who'd given me the kind of pre-engagement briefing that made you feel like maybe this was survivable after all, and who died in the third engagement when a Keth breach unit came through a wall that was supposed to be structurally sound. Private Osa, 18 years old, who died in the Kareth evacuation protecting civilians she'd never met before that day, and who'd never get to be 19. These are some of the 12,417. I didn't fall asleep for a long time. 3 days later, I received a message through the station's internal communication system. It was from a Velthani address. It took me a moment to recognize the designation, and then another moment to understand that I was looking at a message from Evrath Sal's personal account, not the official Velthani liaison office. It was short. Corporal Vale, I have requested your personnel file if that is not an imposition. I have also taken the liberty of consulting your kill count figures for your period of service in the Orel sector. 41 confirmed, and your service record notes this as a secondary function to your primary administrative role. What you said in the hall was correct. I did not acknowledge it at the time in the appropriate way. The Velthani acknowledgement I offered was sincere, but I did not speak. So let me speak now. I have been a soldier for 63 years, by my species' reckoning. I have studied warfare across 8 major conflicts, and I will tell you something I have told very few beings outside my own culture. In the northern corridor of the Orel siege on the 41st day, the Keth broke through our left flank. We were holding, but only barely. We estimated we had 4 to 6 hours before the position became untenable. Human units arrived at hour 3. They did not come because they were ordered to. The formal request had not yet been submitted. A human commander named Lieutenant Colonel Essie Park arrived with 300 soldiers, looked at our position, looked at the Keth position and said, and I was close enough to hear this, "All right, we're here now. What do you need?" They held with us for 11 hours. We lost 41 soldiers that night. Human losses were greater. I have thought about those 11 hours many times since. I did not say anything in the hall because I was startled, a corporal, not an officer, an administrative aide standing in the center of that chamber. It was unexpected. But what you said was right, and the numbers are what they are because of who your people are. I respect that. I wanted to say so directly. Evrath Sal, Senior Liaison Velthani War Host. I read that message 4 times. Then I sent it to Marcus because I thought he should see it. He replied 3 hours later, which was the middle of his night cycle. "Can't sleep anyway," he wrote, "thanks for this." Then, after a pause, "You ever talk to Osa's family?" I had to put down my calm for a minute. Then I wrote back, "Not yet, you." "No," he said, "been thinking about it, don't know what you say." "I don't either," I said. A long pause. Maybe that's okay, he wrote finally. Maybe you don't have to know what to say. Maybe you just have to go. I thought about that for a while. Yeah, I wrote back. Maybe that's the whole thing. 6 weeks after the Count Room session, the Galactic Assembly's Post-Conflict Review Board released its preliminary summary of the Kethalori conflict. It was a long document, hundreds of pages, covering everything from strategic analysis to supply chain assessments to cultural impact studies. The section on human military performance was 3 pages long. It was factual and precise and did not editorialize. But there was a footnote. Footnote 74 on page 312 in the section on notable tactical engagements. It read, "Human forces demonstrated a consistent pattern throughout the conflict that analysts have noted, but found difficult to categorize within standard military assessment frameworks. A tendency to remain in engaged positions significantly longer than optimal withdrawal thresholds would recommend, combined with an apparent willingness to accept disproportionate risk when Allied or civilian lives were at stake. This pattern does not conform to standard efficiency modeling and cannot be fully explained by training differentials or equipment advantages. Reviewing board notes this for further study." I showed it to Captain Fern. She read it once, folded it in half, and put it in her desk drawer. "They called us difficult to categorize," she said. "Is that good?" I asked. She thought about it. "For us," she said, "probably. The last thing I want to tell you about that period, the part of the story that I think about most when I'm lying awake and the station is dark and quiet around me, isn't about the Count Room. It isn't about Evrath Sal's message, or the footnote in the report, or even Marcus and his tremor. It's about something that happened 4 days after the Count Room session, in one of the secondary corridors near the administrative levels. I was walking back from the document archive. It was a quiet part of the station, mostly used by support staff. I came around a corner and nearly ran directly into Veth Coral. We both stopped. He was alone. No other Velthani staff, no official presence. Just him, in a corridor that wasn't on the main routes to anywhere important. We looked at each other. He was taller than me by most of a meter. He had the kind of stillness that Velthani cultivate, the kind that can look like arrogance or calm depending on the context. His ears were angled back, which meant something in Velthani body language, though I could never remember exactly what. I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what to say. He said something first. "I read the supplemental data on the Kareth colony evacuation," he said. His translator rendered it in flat standard, but something in the rhythm sounded like it cost him something to say. "The breakdown of human casualties by hour." I waited. "They lost the most people in the 4th hour," he said. "Of the 9, when the 3rd evacuation wave was running, the Keth renewed the push at that point. Human units at the southern perimeter absorbed it." "Yes," I said. "If the perimeter had broken," he said slowly, "the evacuation would have stopped." "Yes," I said. "The people in the 4th wave," he said, "approximately 900 individuals." "Approximately," I said. He stood there for a moment. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. Not an apology, I don't think it was quite an apology, but it was something in the same neighborhood. "My question in the hall," he said, "was poorly framed." I let that sit. "The figures speak for themselves," he said, which was the most formal way I'd ever heard anyone say I was wrong. I looked at him. He was young, I realized. I'd been so focused on his rank and his bearing and the thing he'd said in the Count Room that I hadn't actually looked at him. He wasn't much older than me, maybe 3 or 4 years, adjusted for species aging differentials. He had the formal manner that Velthani military culture gave you whether you wanted it or not, but underneath it, if you looked, there was someone who'd been to the same war and was carrying the same weight in a different way. "Poorly framed is fair," I said. He nodded, Not the warrior's bow, just a nod. Your figures are accurate, he said. I know, I said. We stood in the corridor for another moment. Then he said, very quietly, almost too quiet for the translator to catch, 4,217. He didn't say anything else, but I understood. He was saying his number the same way I carried mine, not as a statistic, as a thing he walked around with every day. 12,417, I said. We stood in the corridor together for a moment longer. Then we both moved on. I think about that corridor sometimes. I think about what it is that happens when two soldiers from different species stand in a hallway and say numbers at each other like they're the most important thing either of them has said all week. Because they are. The numbers are the shape of the wound. They're the only way to describe something that can't really be described any other way. 12,417 is not a statistic. It is 12,417 moments of a universe without someone in it. 12,417 empty places at tables. 12,417 people who had names and fears and things they were planning to do when they got home. Tevi Marsh, who remembered everyone's birthday. Lieutenant Kang, who could make the impossible sound survivable. Private Osa, who was 18 years old and who went toward the danger instead of away from it because that was the person she was. That's what the number means. That's what I said in the count room, not in so many words, but that's what I meant. When Veth Coral stood up and implied that 63% of the kills said something unflattering about the species that produced them, what he was really missing was that the kills and the dead are the same story. You can't have one without understanding the other. We fought hard because we cared hard. We lost more because we stayed longer. We accumulated a kill count that made the assembly uncomfortable because we were the ones who went first and held longest and came home last. And when they counted us at the end of it, 12,417, they were counting the cost of being the species that goes first. I don't think that makes us better than anyone else. I don't think that's the point. The Velthani go to war with centuries of precision behind them. The Sauri build orbital infrastructure that no other species can match. The Marethians do things with intelligence and information that border on supernatural. Humans go first, humans hold the line. And when the count is done, humans carry their number home with them, in the quiet behind their eyes, in the tremor of a left hand, in the way sleep doesn't come the way it used to. That's the answer to the question Veth Coral asked in the count room. Not a boast, not a justification, just a reckoning. We were there, we did what needed doing. Here are our dead, here are theirs. 63%, 22%, 12,417. Count them, remember them. That's all. Marcus called me once more, a month after the station. He was back on Earth by then. I was still in transit aboard the gas Myrth carrier with Captain Fern and a stack of follow-up documents that needed sorting. You hear about the commendation ceremony? He asked. Captain Fern mentioned it, I said. She said you'd hate it. I hate it, he confirmed. You going? Pause. Yeah, he said. Osa's parents are going to be there. Her mom asked if I'd be there. Another pause longer. Don't know what I'm going to say. You'll figure it out, I said. You said that before. Still true. He was quiet for a moment. 41, he said. I knew what he meant. My confirmed count from Orel sector. Yeah, I said. You remember all of them? He asked. Yes, I said. Me too, he said, both sides. I didn't say anything. That's the weight of it, he said. You carry both sides. That's not something they tell you about in training. No, I said. 247, he said. Plus every one of ours I watch go down. That's the real number. Both sides together. That's what you actually carry. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. Both sides together, that's the real number. I thought about Veth Coral in the corridor saying 4,217 in that quiet voice. I thought about the footnote on page 312. Cannot be fully explained by training differentials or equipment advantages. I thought about Lieutenant Colonel Essie Park arriving at the Velthani flank in hour 3 and saying, "All right, we're here now. What do you need?" I thought about 12,417. And I thought, maybe that's the truest thing about humans that the assembly doesn't know how to put in a report. We carry both sides. We always have.